Welcome to the Fantasy Formula One podcast. I'm your host, Paul, and today's topic is, what are fantasy sports and why do we care? For anybody uninitiated, fantasy sports work like this. Everyone picks various players, drivers, cars, etc. from usually a single league, and to comprise a single imaginary, virtual, or in quotes, fantasy team. And after every set time for a round, so with American football, it's every weekend from Thursday to Monday. With baseball, it's every week. With Formula One racing specifically, it's from weekend qualifying through the end of the Grand Prix. After that time period, performance is converted into fantasy points in accordance with pre-agreed upon rules and metrics. So you get points in baseball, you get points for, things like striking people out, or in football for yards passing or yards rushed, and in F1 for like positions gained and things like that. The points are added up, and there are winners and losers for that round. And then as the rounds progress throughout the season, some sports go into a playoff mode, so like fantasy football and fantasy baseball usually have playoffs. But fantasy Formula One is a straight score for the season added up from all the individual rounds. The issue is, and the reason people like me do podcasts and obsess over minutia, is that the game statistics do not equate to points in the real world, but they do or can in the fantasy world. For example, in football, passing yards does not get the quarterback anything if there's not a touchdown at the end. In baseball, you can strike out the first two batters, but that doesn't mean too much if the next five batters start hitting home runs. And in Formula One racing, if you start 20th and then finish 11th, that still doesn't get the driver or the team any points, towards the championship. But in, fantasy F1, you get points for every position gained. And these sort of the non-scoring factors in the real world matter a whole lot in the fantasy world. And then, people like me like it because we get to use our, minutia, near fanatic, level of knowledge of the sport to compete against other fans who also think they know the sport really well. And then, as we compete, we know there's winners and there's losers, and we feel, and aside from the competition, we feel more involved and have an increased stake in the sport and more validated outwardly because we are openly competing. And, as soon as we're in the top 2/3, well, then we're in the top 2/3 of all the sports, of all the fans, and things like that. There are a lot of leagues, each with a different take on the rules. So, for example, in fantasy football, which is huge here in the United States, I would guess that every person in the United States has either played fantasy football at some point or knows somebody in their first degree. They have a first degree connection to someone who has played. But in fantasy football, you can have leagues that have a defensive line is just basically like one player, or you can have individual defensive positions. You can have passing matter more or less. You can have whatever kind of weight you want. And the same goes with fantasy F1. Which is why here in this podcast, we're going to be focusing on the official fantasy Formula One game that you find at F1.com. There are others, but we're not going to be going near there. You can go ahead and play them yourself and extrapolate out the information if you want. The saying goes that rules are made up and points don't exist. And I love that saying, but there is a third part to it, is that rules are made up and points don't exist, but there are winners. And last year, and there are losers as well. But last year, I finished in the top 3% of the world. There are 2.4 million people playing fantasy Formula One for the 2023 season, and I finished like right around 60,000. And this year I hope to do better, and I hope this podcast helps me as much as it helps you. That being said, there's a couple bits of ground rule that I'm going to have going into it. Is we're going to talk about the drivers, but we're focusing on the race's performance and how it impacts the fantasy Formula One game. We respect all the drivers. The drivers are top in the world. They all rightfully have their seat. And I fully acknowledge that they're driving in the best interest of their career, the best interest of the team, not in the best interest of fantasy Formula One. So as soon as we have people on or off the team, or people's performance goes up or goes down, and things like that, we're not condemning these drivers for being, in quote, bad drivers. No, they're great drivers. We are stating that the way they are driving and their performance is not equating to, or is equating to, points in the fantasy game, and ergo we are moving around our roster. So we are not disrespecting the drivers or the teams or anything like that. We are talking about playing the game, and to do so, we have to critique the performance of the best 20 drivers in the world. So that's what I have for this episode. For episode number 2, we will be reviewing the 2023 rules, and that'll be setting us up to dive into drivers' bios on each of the drivers for the 2023 season. See you next time on the next Fantasy Formula One podcast. Cheers.